Seeing none, we'll move it on to Transport Canada. Any questions of Transport Canada? Yes, Councillor Vaughan. And if you could just introduce yourself, sir.
Hello. Hello, my name's Keith Riley. I'm a Civil Aviation Safety Inspector with Transport Canada, based here in Toronto. And my area is airport zoning regulations and the associated height restrictions.
If this airport were to accommodate jets as contemplated, first of all, can you configure an airport to have one type of airplane fly in and out of it? Is that allowed? Can you restrict it to a particular plane from a particular manufacturer?
I don't believe so, no.
Why would an airport authority make a proposal that is not allowed under current federal regulation?
Well, the airport owner operator holds a certificate from the minister and must comply with the Canadian aviation regulations pertaining to that certificate and the associated standards.
Does this application comply?
What application?
There is no application.
I don't think that Transport Canada has received any formal proposal from
So
the
we're
Toronto.
being asked, let me get this straight, we're being asked to approve the expansion and reconfiguration of this airport, and there has been no application to Transport Canada at all on this file?
Well, I understand that the Toronto Port Authority has submitted some informal proposals, and the Transport Canada has commented on them, but that's as far as I know what's happened.
Have you released your comments to city staff?
I don't believe so. I think
Why not?
I think they went back to the Toronto Port Authority.
Has the Port Authority released them to city staff?
No.
So let me get this straight. There's no formal application. A letter has gone into Transport Canada that somehow details an ambiguous plan to do something. You've commented. That comment's gone back to the Port Authority, and the Port Authority hasn't shared that with the City of Toronto as they ask us to contemplate an expansion of the airport? This statement that the Port Authority is transparent, how do you... Sorry.
Are you correct that that's what's happening?
Is my description of what's happened more or less correct?
Well, I don't think that an airport has to necessarily apply to Transport Canada. What they do is, if they expand, they have to meet the Canadian aviation regulations and the standards, and they have to demonstrate how they would meet them.
So if we say yes to jets and we renegotiate the tripartite agreement, we have cleared the way for them just to negotiate with you on what the airport will be configured like. We no longer have that. We're not part of that conversation effectively. Once the tripartite agreement permits jets, it becomes a conversation solely between Transport Canada and the Port Authority, and the City of Toronto is not party to that conversation, as we are not party now. It's an issue between you, the regulator, and the Port Authority, the operator, and that's it.
Well, they have to meet our regulations and demonstrate how they would do that, and
But once they clear that hurdle, they're free to go.
well, if the tripartite agreement is amended, I suppose, then they could.
So if we do what Mr. DeLuce is asking us to do, which is to amend the tripartite agreement first, at that point forward, the city is out of the conversation to control, scope, or configure the airport. It's simply a matter between the regulator and the operator, and that's it. There's no requirement for you to come to the city and ask what we think.
Well, it's up to the owner of the airport in how they're going to do any expansion and who they have to deal with. We're just concerned that the safety requirements are met.
Right. Can you share the letter that you've received from the Port Authority and the information you returned to them with the city officials? Can I ask you to take that undertaking?
I'll look into it, yes.
You can't say yes today because it may not be possible?
I'm not that familiar with what's happened. As I said,
Right,
my area is airport zoning regulations.
Okay. In terms of the configuration of the airport, if jets are permitted there, what must change at the airport? Let's go through a list. How long must the runway be for this particular jet that they're trying to land?
I can't really answer any of these questions because there's no formal proposal that Transport Canada has received. There's been some dialogue, but there's no knowing exactly what the certification of such an airport would look like.
So you don't know if the 200-meter extension of the runway is in fact a safe guess? Because it's just a guess right now. It's just a theoretical proposal. You haven't actually measured to see whether or not jets require a runway of any particular length.
Well, jets that are landing at a runway have to look to the aircraft specifications for the runway length for takeoff and arrival. So it's dependent on the aircraft.
Right. So if we take Mr. Deluce at his word that 200 meters is, and I understand that 200 meters is what the Port Authority has submitted as their formal request. That's what they've repeated out in the media, but they haven't disclosed publicly, formally. If 200 meters is required, what's the safety apron requirement on a runway that is configured at that length? If you add the 200 meters at each end to the current airport, what safety apron requirements would you require?
Well, the airport runways, depending on their length, have to, they get a code that is assigned to them. And then based on that code, certain standards would apply. So currently the runway is a code 2 runway. I believe that this would bump it up to a code 3. So there's some extra requirements. For example, the strip width would have to increase, the runway strip width. And then the runway itself, depending on the code, it could be a non-instrument, non-precision, or precision runway. So the certification for some sort of expansion at the airport would have to take into account a lot of different measurements and a lot of different input, and there would have to be a team of people from Transport Canada to look at it to decide whether or not they could meet the standards.
So let me get, just to understand that a bit more detail. Flying into a busy urban area with a lot of tall buildings, with an airport that has substantial fog issues and weather issues, because we know that the cancellation of flights there is an ongoing concern for Porter. Would you say that more precision would be required or less precision required flying into a complex airport like that? Is it likely that the highest standards would be applied, or is this an airport that you really don't need to worry about flying into?
The design of the instrument approach is up to NAV Canada, and they would take into account whatever obstacles. And
but you'd agree the more complicated the environment you're flying in, the more need for precision and investment in as much technology to make it as safe as possible. That would be a general recommendation you could see coming forward?
well, obviously more precision is better, but the precision type approach is to get you down lower and break out of cloud, whereas a non-instrument approach, for example, is 500 feet to break through the cloud. So both are safe.
But both are safe, but if you add more safety to this airport, the planes come down lower, further away. Is that right? The way to make this airport safer is to bring the planes down lower from a further distance away, so they have more time to adjust and more time to use automated and safety standards.
Well, each approach is designed in a certain manner to be safe.
Right, and if they come down lower from further away, it's not just a straight approach to the airport. Planes need to be able to abort a landing or a takeoff, and therefore the cone of influence gets bigger the lower and further away you are. It fans out effectively.
Well, there's procedures for when aircraft can't see the runway and make an arrival, so they have to go around. There's a certain procedure, a certain altitude to climb to, a certain place to go, and then to try again or go to another airport.
And tall buildings create a challenge in that scenario. In fact, NAV Canada and Transport Canada quite often create are concerned when new development arises around an airport, because that fan of influence is a significant safety concern.
Well, I would say that obstacles are a significant safety concern, and that when new obstacles are introduced, NAV Canada has to redesign the instrument approach or raise the minima to ensure safety.
When you go to Code 2 to Code 3, do those requirements become more restrictive or less restrictive around development around an airport? As you bring in bigger planes, faster planes with lower approaches, does the zone of influence that the airport imprints on an urban environment become more critical or less critical? Is it easier to build tall buildings next to a Code 3 airport or Code 2 airport?
Well, the airport has certain obstacle limitation surfaces that define the airspace that needs to be kept obstacle-free. And so as long as buildings and structures are below those obstacle limitation surfaces, then the airport meets its certification requirements.
Right, but
if you go from Code 2 to Code 3, for example, the runway strip would increase. So the runway strip encloses the runway. It's a rectangular area. It would increase in width, and the transition surface that comes off the sides would obviously be pushed out further.
that's the marine exclusion zone, for example. You'd have to widen the marine exclusion zone to accommodate a wider runway.
I'm not sure about that. I don't know.
But if the zone expands,
It would go from 45 meters to 75 meters either side of runway centerline.
right? Okay. That's almost a doubling of the exclusion zone on the sides.
I'm not that familiar with the actual
Right.
dimensions of the exclusion zone.
In terms of Code 2 to Code 3, what else has to change? What about fuel tank and location of fuel tanks?
That's not contemplated by the certification of the airport.
Who governs proximity of the fuel tanks to the sides of the runway, especially if they're above ground fuel tanks? Can they be right next to the runway, or do they have to be a certain distance away from the runway?
Well, the runway is enclosed in a strip, so nothing can be within that runway strip.
And is that both north-south? Is that all runways, or is it just the main runway?
No, it's all runways.
And generally, do airports in Code 3 have to have a north-south and an east-west approach, or can they have a simple east-west approach?
You can just have a one runway airport.
That's if you have a second airport in the vicinity?
No, you can have an airport with just one runway, and it could be a Code 3. But a pilot who's flying to an airport has to have an alternate airport to get to.
Right. And so you need an alternate airport that can handle the jet, for example, to land. That's Pearson.
Yes.
Right. Okay, and in terms of safety requirements, what additional safety requirements are required to accommodate a switch from a Code 2 to a Code 3 in terms of firefighting, in terms of emergency services, in terms of response times? Is there any change to the response times as new airplanes arrive?
Well, the airport holding a certificate has to have an airport operations manual approved by the minister, so that airport operations manual would refer to a number of other plans, such as the emergency response plan, the snow plan, disabled aircraft plan. They also have to have a safety management system. So there would be nothing specific unless it was addressed in those plans.
And are airports required to provide that, or are municipal partners often the partner in providing that additional layer of safety?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, the tripartite agreement requires the city to facilitate the safe functioning of this airport, safe access to this airport. If the tripartite government compels the city to pick up the tab for that, and you require them to upgrade their safety based on the reconfiguration of the airport, does the tripartite agreement can you not write a safety standard that the city would have to respond to based on the tripartite agreement?
I can't really speak to that agreement.
Is that information contained in any of the reports that you've read on this file?
As I say, I was asked to come here to talk about height restrictions.
Fair enough.
Based on airport zoning regulations.
Okay, let's get back to airport zoning regulations then. Would you think that a switch from a Code 2 to a Code 3 would create a permission for taller buildings near this airport?
Well, there's
Would it restrict
two.
height or free up height?
There's two things. There's the certification of the airport, where the airport operator has to meet the slopes and length of the approach surface and the transitional surface and the outer surface concerning obstacles. So that's one thing, the certification. The airport zoning regulations are separate than that. They're a federal law that is enacted using the federal regulatory process, and it puts certain restrictions, including height restrictions, on lands adjacent to and in the vicinity of the airport.
And as you move from Code 2 to Code 3, is height regulated down?
Is there any difference?
Does it change?
Well, the airport zoning regulations would only be changed if the airport requested that there be an amendment, and it's a long 2 to 3 year process to amend them.
So if we said yes to jets and yes to a bumping up of this airport from Code 2 to Code 3, that rezoning process would happen afterwards at the request of the airport? And it would be a request made to the federal government, not to the city?
If an airport operator wants to have airport zoning regulations or amend existing airport zoning regulations, yes, they have to come to Transport Canada to request such, and then we would look at it and follow the process.
And you could downzone land as a result of the request if you approve it? You could restrict vacant land coming forward and being developed and downzone it in order to accommodate the safety requirements as prescribed by the airport and the request from the airport.
There's existing airport zoning regulations right now.
But they would become more restrictive if you went from Code 2 to Code 3 if the airport requested them.
So they would become more restrictive, except that existing buildings, structures, and objects would be legally non-conforming if they were there prior to the new regulations.
Would you also have requirements of limiting distance for residential development? Do you space how close to an airport runway residential properties can be? Is that part of the zoning governance that Transport Canada partakes in?
No, the airport zoning regulations don't speak to noise.
So you can put a house at the end of the runway? If it's outside that zone, you can put a house at the end of the runway. There's nothing Transport Canada says. Is Transport Canada silent on how close residential development can be to an airport?
No, we have something called TP 1247, Land Use in the Vicinity of Airports, which is a guidance document to land use authorities on land uses that might be incompatible.
How close to the end of the runway do you recommend residential development?
So Transport Canada recommends recommends that the land use authorities respect the 30 NEF contour line, and that's also reflected in the provincial policy statement that municipalities must be consistent with.
Does this airport currently meet that guideline?
I believe so, but I think the tripartite agreement has something in there about noise contours.
Right, but we don't know whether this airport is currently configured or if the new configuration is consistent with those guidelines in terms of residential proximity to the runway.
Well, we publish the guidelines, but it's up to airports to develop their own NEF forecasts and contour lines.
Can planning help us here? Does the current configuration meet those NEF contour guidelines?
To the best of my knowledge, the answer is yes.
Okay, and if it expands to from Code 2 to Code 3, do those restrictions become more significant or do they stay the same?
Well, they're not restrictions. We just,
Your guidelines.
we just provide guidelines, and it's up to airports to develop their noise exposure forecasts based on their master plan and business plan, and to share them with the municipality. Transport Canada is not involved in that, except that we have a software program that they can use to develop the contours, and then we'll assist them with any technical questions, but we don't approve of NEF contours.
Are you aware of any other airport expansion program that's being driven by a operator, not by the Port Authority? Have you ever seen an expansion plan for Calgary proposed by Air Canada?
Well, I haven't seen any such plan, but
The normal process is for the Port Authority, in this case, or the operator in this case, to make the formal application, not an operator to come to make their application. Is that right?
yeah, the owner, operator of the airport is responsible to meet the standards and regulations, so they would have to come to Transport Canada. If normally, you know, before they're going to spend a lot of money looking at some sort of expansion, they want to have some idea of whether or not they're going to be able to meet the regulations.
And be clear, no formal application from the Port Authority has been submitted to Transport Canada.
Yeah, I understand there's been 2 informal proposals, and there's been some dialogue, but no formal proposal.
And are there any other components of this airport that would have to change in order to accommodate the switch from Code 2 to Code 3 that I haven't covered? That are of concern to you, based on your understanding of its current configuration?
Well, like I said, that some of the dimensions would change, and therefore there might be some, I mean, it's a fairly complicated airport with the boat issue and marine exclusion zone, and I think that, you know, before we could even look at it, we'd have to see what the formal proposal was.
So you wouldn't be able to make those guys, and so the marine exclusion zone, just on the safety apron side of it, the talk of a 200-meter extension at both ends of the runway, is it conceivable that you might come take a look at it, take a look at the configuration of the city as it's built around this airport and say you can't bring the 200 meters into the inner harbor because of the complexities, that all 200 meters should be added to the other 200 meters and it all be extended westward? Is that one of the recommendations you might make based on safety and configuration? That instead of splitting the extension in half and building into the inner harbor, that you might actually say build both ends at the outer harbor?
I don't think that we would make any recommendations at all. We would just look at the proposal and state whether or not it meets the regulations. And if it doesn't meet the regulation, how they're going to meet it.
And right now, you don't know whether the 200 meters at each end of the runway works or not. You haven't actually had a formal analysis of that.
As far as I know.
So it's just a theoretical proposal that it works this way. It may actually turn out that it doesn't work this way. That's conceivable.
I think that Transport Canada has provided some comments on the 2 informal proposals, but with no detail.
But you haven't, you don't know whether you can share that with the city or not. Okay.
Yeah, we're dealing directly with the Toronto Port Authority.
One last set of questions. The current tripartite agreement has a weight restriction for aircraft at this airport. It's not built with a concrete substructure. It's effectively tar on top of sand. Are there any concerns that the weight of these aircraft, which are almost twice as heavy as the turboprop, is there any concerns that the physical infrastructure to support the weight of these planes, particularly in the summertime when the tar gets hot, is there any concern that they may not have the physical capacity to host these airplanes? Is that an issue that Transport Canada is concerned itself with?
Well, normally an airport would publish a pavement load rating, and then aircraft that were going to use that airport would see whether or not they could meet that. In some cases, airports might have certain taxiways or runways that couldn't take certain aircraft because of the weight.
But you haven't done that analysis yet?
Not that I know of, no.
And with regard to that, one last question. How do you expand this airport while you operate it? How do you add 200 meters plus safety aprons, which we anticipate will be a new regulation coming forward, so, and approximately about 50 meters, we're told, on each end of this runway. So you're talking about half a kilometer of extension, 500 meters. how do you extend a runway while operating full-time? Is that permitted under Transport Canada's rules and regulations? To effectively fly airplanes off a runway under construction?
The airport would submit a construction plan, and we would look at it to make sure that, that what they're proposing allows them to continue to meet the regulations. In some cases, runways are worked on at night. In some cases, the runway threshold is displaced, and the shorter runway is available.
So you use it, but there's only one runway here that handles the turboprops, only the east-west runway. That's the one they want to expand, and that's the only one that currently is in place to facilitate the operation of this airport. How do you build a runway and operate an airport simultaneously under your rules and regulations?
Well, like I say, they would have to continue to meet the regulations. So if they had to shut the runway down, if they only have one runway available to the turboprops, maybe they would have to stop operations for a while. I don't know. And
after we approve, we'd find that all out after we approved, because we haven't had a formal application. There's been no real appraisal of this proposal. We'd find that out later, that they have to close the airport in order to facilitate the expansion. That would come later.
I can't really comment on how they're going to do it.
Have you ever seen a proposal approve the expansion first and consider the details later like this? Is that the normal way of doing this? Is it the smart way of doing this?
I would say that that an airport should have an airport master plan so that they can look ahead to.
Have you seen the airport master plan? Have they submitted the airport master plan to you?
No, we don't have any requirement for an airport master plan.
All right, thank you.
We have a visiting councillor with questions. Councillor Cho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of questions already raised by Councillor Adam Bond. The whole thing is new to me, so some of the questions I'm asking you may be very elementary. When new airport is constructed, or like this one, when they expand the runway or airport, what's the procedure? They have to get the approval, formal approval from the Airport Canada?
No, what they do is they submit a plan of construction. And based on the plan of construction, we see how they're going to continue to meet the regulations and the standards that apply to that airport. And so in some cases, they might, like I was saying, they might have to close a runway, or they might have to operate only a certain portion of the runway while they work on the other end. But we don't approve of their expansion. We just receive the plan of construction to make sure that we're satisfied that they can continue to meet the regulations.
So it's not the formal approval they need from Airport Canada, but they have to seek your opinion, professional opinion, is okay or not?
The airport has an airport certificate, so they must continue to meet the requirements associated with that certificate. Transport Canada used to be an owner and operator of airports. Now we're strictly the regulator. So an airport should go to an aviation consultant to look at expansion plans to make sure that whatever is built continues to meet certification requirements.
So in your answer earlier, there were a couple informal proposals, but there has not been written formal proposal from the Billy Bishop Airport. So when they submit the formal, only then you could respond formally, right? So you don't have a position as of now.
Well, I don't know that it's a position. If we got a formal proposal, it would be that we might ask in certain areas, well, how do you meet the certification standards here? The standards say one thing, what you've proposed doesn't meet it, so how are you going to meet it? If the proposal meets all the standards and regulations, then we're not concerned, because then safety and security is looked after.
Okay, so when they submit the formal proposal, I could guess then there's a checklist, whether it's environment, whether it's safety, whether it's public health, whether it's a public consultation from the residents, et cetera, et cetera. So do you have that kind of checklist? And then where you meet this part in your proposal, but your information is not complete, so could you bring all these answers? So I just imagine that when the proposal comes to you, it's going to be sent back to them and back and forth before you form the, okay, we are satisfied, or no, we shouldn't approve all these requirements. What's the procedure like?
Well, the procedure is that an airport that's expanding must continue to meet the certification requirements. They have an airport operations manual, which tells what code of runway it is and what kind of lighting there is, and other aspects of the standards. So that airport operations manual would have to be approved, and the amendment would have to be approved. But the proposal for the expansion of the runway, we don't approve of them expanding or not expanding. It's up to them. But if they do expand, they have to meet the certification requirements.
So I gather when they make a formal proposal, then you have to make sure, okay, these are the requirements, so you have to satisfy that. And then they say, yes, we'll do, or we cannot do that. That kind of communication will take place between Airport Canada and the applicant?
Well, the applicant, the onus is on the applicant to know what the standards and certification requirements are. It's up to them to meet those requirements. So they have to go to whomever, an aviation consultant, to demonstrate that they will meet those requirements.
Okay, I will be one of the counselors who will participate in making decision. So if we don't get the formal response from Airport Canada, I don't know. So why is it premature? So we could defer so that we get the response, formal response from Airport Canada, from other agencies too. So you think it's the right way at this point? Is it premature to City Council to make a decision?
I think that's beyond my ability to answer you. I mean, that's a personal opinion. I'm not going to answer for Transport Canada. I think that they need to demonstrate how they're going to meet the certification requirements, and if they are able to do that, then Transport Canada would be satisfied. But there's no formal proposal. You know, there's been some work done. There's been some informal dialogue between Transport Canada and the Toronto Port Authority. That's as far as it's gone that I know of.
Okay, I will go back to the question I raised earlier. Even at the city, when a developer make application, build a couple houses or 10 houses, and then after the application, the planning department send out the application to parks, maybe transportation, other professional departments to come to the final decision. So when you get the formal proposal from applicant, you send out all these proposals to different sub-department, whether it's environment, whether it's transportation, whether it's whatever, or you just make a transportation, Transport Canada, okay or no? What's the procedure like once it's applied?
You're talking about city
No,
applications?
I'm not talking about Transport Canada, when they make a formal approval.
Are you talking about The Toronto Port Authority making?
Yes, no, I'm talking about Transport Canada. When the Billy Bishop Airport make a proposal in writing formally, what's the procedure? You give that proposal to different sub-departments before you come to final decision?
I would imagine that the same thing would happen as what happened with the informal proposals, that we would assemble a team of experts because it's quite a technical area and it involves a lot of different areas that we need to draw on. So I believe the last time we put together a panel of experts in Ottawa to look at the informal proposal and make comments. I imagine a more formal proposal would involve another expert panel and possibly, you know, we would have to draw in more people to take a look at it. But this type of situation doesn't occur that often because many of the airports are not constrained the way this airport is with the water and everything. Many airports, you know, are already built, or else they're in, you know, rural areas where there's no problem with expansion. This airport has, you know, certain technical challenges, and they've had to apply for certain exemptions to the zone or to the regulations and the standards. So all of that would have to be looked at again, and it would involve a panel of experts.
So referring to panel of experts, get their response, and then you come to conclusion. To do all this, how long does it take? 1 year, 2 years, 3 years?
I don't know.
You don't know. So in other words, you don't have that much answer anyway, right? It's silly to maybe get all these answers before we come to final decision making.
Well, like I said, Transport Canada deals with the certificate holder. So we deal with the Toronto Port Authority as the owner-operator of the airport.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cho. Councillor Perks.
Thank you. I wanted to follow on some of the questions Councillor Cho was asking. Do you have any statutory obligation when you get a formal application to circulate to other agencies or consult? Are you required to check with anybody, or is it just you just make the decision, you just review it internally?
We would just review it internally to ensure they met the certification requirements.
Okay. Are the proceedings of the expert panel, when you deal with a formal application, public?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. Now you mentioned that in response to a question from Councillor Cho, that their application may require them to have certain exemptions from the guidelines or so on. I take it that would be for example, existing buildings that would be within the envelope. That kind of thing. Is that what you're talking about?
What I would say is that there's already, you know, certain things in place because of the boat traffic. And I think that's one of the main concerns.
Right. In response to a question from Councillor Vaughan, I know he asked you a lot, so you might not remember. If there were if there are people who have zoning permissions, they're not built out, but zoning permissions that would grant them a certain height, and that height went into the envelope that your guidelines would require be clear, you could approve the envelope and sterilize those existing permissions?
You're talking about the airport zoning regulations?
Yes.
Well, there's existing regulations in place with height restrictions.
I'm saying if you get the new application, right?
Yes, it would go through a public consultation process, just like any federal regulation. And, you know, for most buildings, like residential development, it's not usually a problem.
Well, as you've said, this isn't usual. I'm just trying to understand, okay, let's break this into a couple of parts. First of all, when you say like any regulation, it goes through a consultation, do you mean it gets gazetted and then people have an ability to comment, or is there some other special process that's laid out?
There's a specific process laid out, but it follows the federal regulatory process. So it would start with a request from the airport. There would be early consultation with the municipal planning departments, with any Aboriginal groups, and there'd be a public notice published of Transport Canada's intent to amend the regulation. Then it would go to Canada Gazette Part 1 after approval from Treasury Board for pre-publication in the Canada Gazette. There would be a 60-day formal public consultation period, during which time people could make written representations to the minister, and there would be some sort of public information session held, well, probably not at the airport, probably downtown Toronto. And then at the end of that 60-day consultation period, if there were no outstanding issues, Treasury Board would look at it and give final approval. And then the zoning regulation, the plans, the cadastral fabric would have to be updated, and it would be deposited in the local land titles and registry offices, and it would be deposited on each person's property title.
Okay. So I'm trying to imagine a scenario, and it may be outside your expertise to answer this, but let's suppose all of that happens, and you deposit a regulation on title for someone who owns a property in the city of Toronto, and that regulation restricts their height below what they had a reasonable expectation of getting approval for under the City of Toronto's current official plan and zoning regulations. Effectively, that's a down zoning. Is there any right of appeal to the down zoning after it's been approved by Treasury Board? Is there any compensation? Is there an expropriation process? Or are they just simply, their rights just vanish?
Well, the zoning would not go over the city. It would probably be much the same as it is now, except for the slope of the approach surface for...
Yes, I appreciate. Within that exception, though, within the exception of the slope for the approach, if that created a restriction on title in terms of what someone could build out to in terms of height, what are the rights of that property owner? Do they simply vanish? Do they have a further right of appeal of the regulation? Do they have the right to have that portion of their property rights expropriated with compensation? Or what?
Well, there's no person's entitled to any compensation from the airport zoning regulations, but the time to speak up would be when it's published in the newspaper and during the 60-day consultation period.
I appreciate that people should speak up during that period of time. I'm just wondering if they speak up and nevertheless lose. So you're telling me that they have no rights, that your agency can simply zone out of existence property rights that they previously enjoyed and they're not entitled to compensation?
Well, if people are in residential areas, most...
No, property owners.
Well, if you're talking, you know, large condos, for example, correct, they would be restricted in height. For most residential...
And they're not entitled to any compensation, and once the regulation is passed, that's it?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Perks. Councillor McConnell.
Thank you very much, and it's quite helpful because many of us have been trying to get at some of these understandings for quite some time. So can you tell me, TP 1247, is that, you know, the size of this? Is it now, what is that particular document? What does it look like?
It's just,
Like, is it 50 pages, 5, 9?
it's probably somewhere
1,000?
around 50 pages.
Right,
It's
okay.
available on the internet if you look for it.
Well, I might just do that. I was just going to ask if you could perhaps send us the link to that. Would that be the regulation that eventually will be the framework for a zoning change if necessary? Is that what we look to for these rules?
No, TP 1247 is a guidance document which is intended for land use authorities so that they have an idea of what types of land uses may be incompatible with an airport.
Right.
So that when they make decisions,
Right.
they take that into account.
Well, that's what I'm saying, because we are the land-using authorities, and we're being asked now to take into consideration an official plan, which now has to take into account an airport expansion. And this is, like, so for example, the Royal Bank expansion down onto the central waterfront of somewhere in the neighborhood of 60-odd stories in close proximity. Is that of concern to the regulations around 1247?
Well, as I said, the TP 1247 is guidelines.
Right.
The airport must continue to comply with the certification standards. Those are contained in TP 312.
Ah, another one, okay. TP,
That is a much thicker document.
all right, TP, what was that one, 312?
TP 312.
All right. So you might wonder why we're all so interested in this. Certainly, the counselor for the islands and also for most of the waterfront, Councillor Vaughan, is the counselor for the neighborhood where we're on the land side of the airport. And so all of this is under redevelopment. And so what we're trying to get at and figure out is what are if this airport expands, what are going to be the subsequent implications on the city's waterfront approved plan. That's one of the pieces that we have no idea about. And by the way, just so you know, no idea about what the current regulations state. Not of any interaction when we're doing major development. So it's only in the most recent time that we've actually heard that perhaps there's some issues. So that's why I think that kind of information is very useful to the land developers and to the land regulators, which is, of course, this community council. Would you, as you know these regulations, the fuel tanks not having enough distance away from the runways, is that of concern by the regulations? Like, do they regulate how far, or?
Well, our certification standards would have some impact on objects that were in the runway strip. So you can't have obstacles within the runway strip or obstacles that would penetrate any of the obstacle limitation surfaces on the airport. But we don't have specific regulations concerning fuel tanks. I believe Environment Canada has some regulations on fuel tanks.
So you don't care, I don't mean you personally, but Transport Canada doesn't care how close the fuel tanks are to the runways. They don't. I grant you that this is a very unusual airport. But I'm a bit surprised that your regulations don't
We
have
do
a
care.
distancing.
And that's what I'm saying, that you can't have any tanks, you can't have any objects within the runway strip or that would penetrate the slopes of the obstacle limitation surfaces.
And is there a sort of a, somewhere either that you have or we can obtain something that tells us what currently is in place and what exemptions have been given for what is currently in place?
Well, I think you would probably go to the Toronto Port Authority to get that. But,
Really? So let me just ask you this question. Is it not the landowner that you would be required to make sure is aware of all of these pieces as opposed to the leasee?
Is it not the landowner?
The city is the landowner.
Well, like I was saying before,
This is leased land, right? I mean, you understand that, it's leased land.
we deal with the certificate holder,
Yes?
and we require that the certificate holder meet all the standards and regulations pertaining to the operation of an airport.
But what about the landowner?
Well, I guess you're in charge. You have a lease or whatever. You
So if we're in charge,
You go
but
to
we're
the
not
port.
allowed to have any of we're not given any of the documents from the Port Authority, and we're not allowed to get them from Transport Canada, then could you explain to me as a landowner what our rights are in terms of the uses and the changes to our land?
If I can just interject from city legal,
Yes.
the
Where are
the
you?
tripartite. I'm over here, Councillor.
There you go.
And I will follow up again with real estate colleagues. But the tripartite, which does date back to '83,
Yes.
does have a provision requiring the operator comply with all such laws. So there would be a provision in there to that extent.
I get that.
Okay.
I do get that.
Okay.
I get they're supposed to, but they haven't. So what I'm getting to is, what is the requirement of the federal agency to make sure that the, not the compliance, but rather that the landowner has been informed of what is occurring on their land, what has been regulated? And do you have any other airports that aren't owned by the operator?
There's some airports that are operated by an airport authority.
Oh, yeah, no, I get that, but then the land itself is under their jurisdiction. This is one in which it's a leased land. Do you have any others that are leased?
I can't think of any offhand.
Okay. And so I'd like you to think about, I don't expect you to answer this question, particularly in public, but I do want you to think about what your federal obligations are of Transport Canada to the owner of the land. And the fact that we don't have any of those regulations to know whether or not what's happening and our responsibility on our land. Now, the second one is, when you're looking at regulations, I've asked you about 60-story buildings that are going up in the neighborhood, already approved. One for 80 stories that has been proposed, don't know where that will go. All within the shoreline. I'm going to call it the shoreline of the takeoff of these. Oh, and now, of course, our new aquarium. If you hadn't had a chance, go and see it. It's fabulous. I want to know, in terms of all of those proximities of large numbers of people and tall skyscrapers, whether or not your regulations require those to be taken into consideration before you extend the zoning or changes to the zoning. Like, is it only that we have to take care of whatever happens at the airport, or is there a responsibility for an airport to also take care of what's going on around them under your regulations?
Well, like I said, under our regulations, the airport would come to us with plans and would demonstrate how they were expanding and how they would continue to meet the regulations and the standards. And that's what we would be concerned with the safety of the airport.
But you don't have any other airports in the middle of a growing, huge metropolitan city in the center, within 350 meters of condos and residential.
Well, there's the Downsview Airport.
I don't really think we would say that that was along a corridor that has 60 and 70-story buildings, or that has the ACC and the Rogers within close proximity. I don't think they're in the same ballgame. And it's not a commercial in and out passenger airport. Isn't that fair?
That's fair, but I'm just saying
Try
that,
to be fair.
that either airport's the same thing, you
But
know.
I guess my point is, and that's what I'm trying to get at, is they are not the same thing. That when you have a city that is already growing around it, that is not single-family homes or small mid-rise apartment buildings, it is quite different to have a proximity to the financial district of a community, the major sports centers of a community, places like along the waterfront for concerts and so on. I mean, if anything goes wrong here, it really goes wrong here. So that's what I'm trying to get at is, are there protective policies or regulations that protect? I get that they protect the airport, but what are the protections for people who live within 300 meters, and children who go to school within 300 meters of runways? What within your regulations, although this might be different, protects those people? Anything?
Like I was saying, the regulations
I don't
protect
know
for the
whether-
they protect for the safety of the airport and aircraft. And in that way, they
Right,
they
so I
protect.
get that. I really get that. I understand that. What I'm trying to get at is that it seems to me that there's protection on the one side of the coin, which is, the passengers in the airplane, the people who are the pilots who are driving the airplane, all of those people, but there doesn't seem to be anything other than downzoning and getting people out of the way that protects the people who are in close proximity. And in a situation where you can't change what is there, and it is high density, high volume, then what are the mechanisms what's the firewall between that protection of the people who are either living or working or playing within that proximity zone? Nothing?
Well, I think that question would best be answered by the other agencies that look after the environment and pollution and that sort of thing.
I'm not talking about pollution. I'm not talking about environment. I'm talking about the one moment that a bird strike happens and the plane goes out of control. That's what I'm talking about. What are the firewalls that protect communities from? I mean, we saw what happens when a plane goes into a high-rise. Like, what are the protections? Do you take that into consideration when you're looking at these airports?
What we take into consideration are compliance with the standards, the safety standards that provide a level of safety that's acceptable.
Level of safety to whom? Just the airport, just the pilots, just the passengers, or to the surrounding community and the surrounding uses?
Well, they apply to the airport operator, but I would say that they take into account everybody by providing safe operations.
My final question is, what exemptions have been given to this airport that, actually, we don't know about any exemptions, so what exemptions were given to them?
I don't know
I don't expect it off the top of your head. Can you get us what exemptions were given to this airport? Is that possible?
I'll endeavor to do so.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we do have the city's aviation consultant who may be able to address this matter currently.
Yeah, good day. So we've already mentioned a couple of the key exemptions. So one being the obstacle limitation surfaces on the eastern side where the slope is 6.38%. And I'm mentioning that because if you go in that document that we were mentioning earlier, TP312, you'll see something that's different. So that's what we mean by exemption. Going from a Code 2 to a Code 3 runway, and as Mr. Riley was mentioning earlier, there is a change in slope depending on the type of approach, which is, in this case is with instrument, non-precision. Currently I believe it's 3.33% going down to 2.5, but the exemption currently is set as 6.38%.
Is it possible at some point, thank you for that information. I don't know about the other members of the Community Council, but for me, this is a bit like talking in a different language, because of course it has very little meaning for somebody, but it's exceedingly important. And I wonder if it would be possible either offline or through some other way to kind of talk a little bit about what the implication of those changes would be, both on the safety of our community. You've been around, you've heard this over and over again, but also on our ability to regulate development along the water. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've just got a couple of questions of transport, the representative from Transport Canada. Are you familiar enough with the FAA regulations around hazardous wildlife attractants with respect to bird strikes that I can ask questions of what the difference is between Canada and the FAA?
I'm not that familiar with the FAA requirements.
Well, my questions may be abstract enough that your expertise would carry over. The FAA regulations around it, there's one for piston-powered aircraft and one for turbine-powered aircraft. Why would the turbine-powered aircraft ones be more stringent, require a greater distance of setbacks than the piston-powered one?
I would think that it's because the turbine aircraft are moving faster and it's more difficult for birds to get out of the way.
There's also an even more stringent requirement for the protection of approaches, departures, and circling airspace. Is that the same? Is that the same for Transport Canada regulations?
Well, part of the regulations pertaining to airports requires them to have an airport wildlife management plan, and that plan has to be reviewed every 2 years by the airport operator, or in case there's certain other triggers that might require a review.
So if we could just go through the airport, the template for Transport Canada's airport wildlife management plan. Can you explain the difference between passive and active management techniques?